This second lecture of our opponents segment of the course takes up the possibility of sexism against men. In part 1, we'll talk about the idea that men are better off than women in some respects, but women are better off than men in other respects, and it might just be that everything shakes out at roughly even. In parts 2 and 3, we'll talk about the idea that even if there is a first or primary sexism against women, there is also a second or secondary sexism against men that anyone who cares about sexism should also care about. Part 1. 4 puzzles on gender equality. Phillipe van Parijs is a Belgian political philosopher and someone with a clear understanding of the role of the academic and a firm commitment to fulfilling that role. He writes, for example, that facing a disapproving, even indignant audience is part of the price we have to accept paying occasionally for playing our role as academics. In other words, people whose fate is not dependent on their popularity and who therefore have the freedom to say what they believe is right, even if their audience does not like to hear it. This is how he came to decide, when invited to give a 10-minute talk at a 2013 event aimed at advancing women in the workplace, that he would spend his time being gently provocative, taking the opportunity for a common reflection on real and difficult issues rather than for a rambling rehearsal of well-meaning platitudes. When he finished his talk, he was booed by part of the audience, and a male audience member said during the subsequent discussion that it was an insult to both women and philosophy. Van Parijs does not blame this reaction entirely on his audience. He explains that there were technical difficulties leading to a change in the language of the debate, that he skipped some qualifications, and that he used a metaphor in English to caveat his tone and style that was likely incomprehensible to a Dutch and French audience. This paper, 4 Puzzles on Gender Equality, is his attempt to clarify and expand on his thoughts from that event. Let's start with 2 thought experiments and 1 provocative analogy that he presents in the paper. For now, just note your own responses, then we'll talk about what Van Parijs predicted your response to be and what he thinks the implications of such judgments are. Thought experiment number 1. Imagine a society in which one gender dies on average at age 50, the other at age 55, but the former has an average annual income 10% higher than the latter, with everyone guaranteed a decent minimum income. If this is all you know, which gender would you prefer to belong to? That is, do you prefer to have more money or do you prefer to live longer? Thought experiment number 2. Suppose you can choose between 2 electoral systems, one in which only women can vote and only men can be elected, and one in which only men can vote and only women can be elected. Which would you prefer? That is, which do you prefer, the choice of who will represent you, or being the one who gets to represent others? And the analogy. Those men who waste their money on prostitutes or misbehave in a way that gets them into trouble, whether incarceration or reputational precipice. They did not choose to be men any more than those born poor chose to be born poor. And had they been women rather than men, they would not, probabilistically speaking, have to bear these burdens. Is the analogy between the 2 cases not so strong that it would be inconsistent to regard the inequalities mentioned as an aspect of an injustice suffered by the poor, but not as an injustice suffered by men? That is, if we think in general that accidents of birth can place people in unequal circumstances that are unjust, on what grounds could sex be denied as being one of these? Okay, now let's see what Van Parijs predicted your response to have been. On higher income versus longer life, he says, my guess is that many of us would go for the longer life. On choice of representative versus being the representative, he says, isn't it obvious that those concerned with the fate of all women, rather than the career prospects of a few, should prefer the former to the latter? And finally, on the analogy between poverty and maleness, he says, why is it that my intuition, and presumably yours, is different in the 2 cases? The thought experiments and analogy point us toward real or purported group-level differences that may or may not be a matter of injustice. One group lives longer while the other has a higher income. One group has more of the vote while the other is more elected. And one group has biological propensities that lead them to bad outcomes while the other group doesn't. These are 3 of the 4 puzzles of gender equality mentioned in the paper's title. The 4th is a version of the first. One group has higher income while the other has greater educational achievement. Here's the general form of the puzzles, where the groups we're interested in might be racial, religious, cultural, and so on. 1. If society gives group B more money per unit of time, while nature gives group A more units of time, can it always be said that there is an unjust inequality at the expense of group A? 2. If society gives group B more money and group A better education, can it always be said that there is an unjust inequality at the expense of group A? 3. If group B enjoys a majority among power holders and group A a majority among those who choose the power holders, can it always be said that there is an unjust inequality at the expense of group A? And 4, if group B's genetic endowment makes its members more likely to end up in prison, can this ever be counted as an injustice suffered by its members, none of whom chose not to be born a member of the less incarceration-prone group A? Applied to thinking about inequalities between the sexes in particular, the thought is that we could restate the puzzles as 4 dimensions along which men seem to be disadvantaged. Namely, men can expect to live less years. In a growing number of countries, they are on average less educated than women. They form an electoral minority, and their greater propensity to misbehave means that the overwhelming majority of the prison population is drawn from their ranks. His conclusion is mild. He only asks us to take these puzzles seriously and thinking about the ideal of equal opportunity that underlies much of the struggle for greater gender justice. He does not claim that these disadvantages to men are of the same importance as those women face. He does not necessarily claim that they count as gender injustice. He says very clearly early in the paper that nothing in what I am going to say amounts to belittling the importance of these various dimensions or to denying that the disadvantages incurred by women along these dimensions far exceed the advantages I am about to sketch. He just thinks that as things change, for example, as women make more and more progress, these things may come to have more significance. Still, one could extract a stronger conclusion than this. If it's just as good to have a good education as a good income, or just as good to live longer than to have a higher income, then it's not that men are advantaged and women are disadvantaged. It's that both men and women are advantaged and disadvantaged in different ways. And it's an open question who has the worse bundle overall. And it might turn out that the bundles are balanced in the end. That would be one way to understand Bryan Caplan's view in this debate we had for Louise Perry's Maiden Mother Matriarch podcast, as raising questions about the more negative parts of men's bundle of goods in order to gesture toward the conclusion that the bundles might in the end be roughly equivalent. Von Parijs's paper was published in a special issue of the journal Law, Ethics and Philosophy, or LEAP, along with criticisms and his response. All of the responses except one reject von Parijs's suggestion that the inequalities in question might be injustices. The exception is Gina Schouten, who takes up the analogy between being born poor and being born male, agrees that it is reasonable, and agrees that inequality in incarceration rates specifically is an injustice. She starts with the harms of incarceration: foregone opportunities for flourishing, alienation from spouses and children, enhanced risk of being oneself a victim of violence, and difficulty finding and keeping employment subsequent to release. Then the thought is, if men are more likely than women to suffer these harms through no fault of their own, then there might be an injustice here. Her strategy in the paper, rather than arguing directly for the claim that it is an injustice, is rather to consider ways to dispel the puzzle and show that they fail. That means that it remains open that the puzzle could be dispelled by some better response for all that she says. The ways to dispel the puzzle that she considers are: male violence has a social, not a genetic cause; male violence harms others; male violence is always a choice; even if greater male incarceration is an inequality that matters, it's not an injustice because overall men benefit from the inequalities against women. And finally, even if greater male incarceration is an inequality that matters, it's hardly urgent. I won't go through all of these, but let me explain two of the more interesting ones. The first about the cause of male violence, and the third about male violence being a choice. The first way to try to dispel the puzzle is to say that this difference between men and women that produces men's higher rates of violent crime and therefore leads to men's higher rates of incarceration is social, not genetic. What von Parijs puts down to hormones may actually be the differential socialization of boys compared to girls. But Schouten says this is a red herring. It doesn't matter whether what leads to greater propensity to violent crime in men is biological, social, or whichever combination of both. She gives an analogy to two deaf children, one whose deafness is genetic and one whose deafness was due to an environmentally caused early childhood disease. Both might have a remedy. So too for men's greater propensity to violent crime. Whatever the source of men's greater aggression, it could be addressed through collective social action, either by efforts to change socialization patterns, by existing gene selection and therapy, or by developing new technologies for genetic modification. It might help to try thinking about this relative to other groups. For example, psychopathy might be genetic and create a much greater propensity to violence. Growing up in the mafia is obviously social, but might do the same thing. Neither being born with the disposition to psychopathy nor being born into a mafia family is chosen. Is the fact of being more likely to end up in jail an injustice in one case and not the other? Do you have stronger intuitions about where we should put resources into intervening? And if so, is it in the genetic case or is it in the social case? The third way to try to dispel the puzzle is to lean into the fact that a propensity toward violence doesn't entail the doing of violence. A man still has to choose to act on that propensity. And when he does, this is no longer something that is through no fault of his own. His actions are his responsibility. And so his incarceration following his choice to do crime is his responsibility. And there's no injustice here. Schouten responds to this by noting that there's parallel reasoning about women's choices to sacrifice career opportunities for care responsibilities. And the mere fact that they choose that doesn't mean there's absolutely nothing else to say about justice. We can acknowledge people's choices and their responsibility for those choices and still talk about the injustice of certain background conditions that push them toward making those choices. If that's true for women and work, then it's hard to see why it shouldn't be true for men and violence. She writes, in both cases, the inequalities in the background against which the relevant choice is made are not chosen. And in both cases, the relevant choice is harmful to the chooser. And she goes on, through no fault of their own, women are ex ante likelier to be worse off in virtue of their greater likelihood to prioritize the needs of dependents over their careers. Through no fault of their own, men are ex ante likelier to be worse off in virtue of their greater likelihood to engage in violent behavior. Ex ante here means as a matter of prediction. Society may have an obligation to intervene on the background conditions in order to reduce the incidence of crime, which will have the effect of reducing instances of incarceration. In the conclusion to the paper, Schouten suggests interventions such as making prisons safer, which then reduces the extent to which incarceration is a harm, using technologies like drug or gene therapies to lessen aggressiveness, and using education reform. She concludes by saying, it is indeed counterintuitive to think that men are the victims of injustice because their genetic or social endowment makes them likelier to end up in prison. It might nonetheless be true. Let's now move on to David Benatar, who will also emphasize specific dimensions of male inequality, but who has more to say about the steps between observing inequality to establishing that there is injustice, or his specific concern that there is sexism against men. Part 2, The Second Sexism. The Second Sexism is a book first published in 2012. It's also the title of a paper published 9 years earlier, part of a special issue that included 4 responses and a final word from Benatar, but I'll focus on the book here. The most important chapters in the book, in my view, are Chapter 2 and Chapter 4. Chapter 2 sets up the inequalities that will be of concern. This material is descriptive. The goal is just to establish that there is a difference between men as a group and women as a group. It is Benatar's parallel to von Parijs's examples of life expectancy, income, education, voting and being elected, and propensities to violent crime. Chapter 4 argues that the inequalities are unjust. The material in this chapter is normative, attempting to establish that these are not morally neutral differences, but are rather the kinds of differences we should care about and do something about. For those who are interested in this distinction between mere inequality and unjust inequality in another context, the Harvard economist Roland Fryer makes it in the context of a lecture about police violence, noting that it is a common mistake of newspaper headlines to simply announce an inequality, like more black people than white people being stopped for vehicle searches, as though that is therefore an injustice. Fryer's point is that no, we need a lot more information in order to establish that it is an injustice. I've linked to his lecture in the video description. Here in part 2, I'll focus on the descriptive case for inequality where males are on the worse off side, and in part 3, I'll focus on the normative case for describing some or all of this inequality as injustice, or actually as sexism specifically. We'll talk more about that when we get to that part. First, let me give you Benatar's full list of male disadvantages, which he discusses at length in Chapter 2. Then I'll say a bit more about a few of them. And I've put a star next to those that have already come up in our discussion from Part 1. So here's the list: conscription and combat, violence, corporal punishment, sexual assault, circumcision, education, family and other relationships, bodily privacy, life expectancy, imprisonment, and capital punishment. As you'll see, Benatar's list is more extensive than von Parijs's, and von Parijs's example of voting and being elected is not on Benatar's list, although this might not be meaningful because the Phillipe special issue came out after the Second Sexism. Let me present some of Benatar's case for including 3 of these entries in particular: conscription and combat, violence, and family and other relationships. I've chosen these 3 because conscription and combat and family and other relationships are persuasive on their face, whereas there are easier responses available to some of the others, and indeed Benatar himself is not sure that they all count, with circumcision being the entry that he seemed the most ambivalent about. And because I think his inclusion of violence reveals some of the challenges facing his view, which I'll talk more about in Part 3. First, conscription and combat. Benatar himself takes this to be perhaps the most obvious example of male disadvantage. Consider the penalties for avoiding conscription in countries that have had it or still have it: self-imposed exile, imprisonment, physical assault, or in the most extreme circumstances, execution. At his time of writing, 80 countries still had some form of conscription. Even in places where there isn't legal conscription, there can still be huge social pressures on men to join the military, including the use of shame and ostracism. Benatar writes, "It may be hard for people in contemporary Western societies to understand how powerful these forces have been in other contexts. However, young men and even boys have felt and been made to feel that their manhood is impugned if they fail to enlist. In other words, they would be cowards if they failed to respond to the call to arms. Women, oblivious to their own privilege in being exempt from such pressures and expectations, have sometimes taken a lead in shaming men who they thought should already have volunteered." Even where there is conscription of women, as in Israel, Benatar writes that treatment of women conscripts is more lenient. Men are conscripted for 3 years and women 2. Men serve in the reserves until they are 54 and women only until they are 24. Married women are exempt, but married men are not. Women are not sent into combat. As to combat itself, he writes, millions of men have been killed in combat. They have been clubbed with various instruments, decapitated with swords and cannonballs, hacked with axes, penetrated in every part of the body, the head, chest, abdomen, genitals, and limbs, by arrows, bullets, and shrapnel, and blown to smithereens. They have been poisoned with gas, burned alive, crashed to their deaths in aircraft, drowned and hemorrhaged internally from the pressure of blasts. Some die instantly, others have bled to death, succumbed to infections, or otherwise perished from their wounds over periods of varying duration. Some mortally wounded have died slowly on the battlefield because timely evacuation for medical treatment was impossible. And of the casualties, he writes, not all casualties are fatal. Some are relatively mild, but nonetheless a disadvantage relative to women who were spared such injuries by being exempt from combat. Serious injuries, however, are extremely common. Men have lost limbs, jaws, noses, ears, and eyes. They have been blinded, deafened, paralyzed, and disfigured in innumerable ways. Nor are all the wounds physical. The trauma of combat, being injured, witnessing the gruesome deaths and wounds of comrades, and even inflicting such on enemies, can readily cause psychological trauma. Soldiers can be haunted for decades by their combat experiences, impacting negatively on their lives in myriad ways. Finally, even of those men who are conscripted but don't end up in combat, Benatar notes that there are still serious costs. Careers are interrupted, conscripts are separated from their families, they are subjected to serious invasions of privacy, restrictions on freedom, demeaning treatment, and harsh discipline. Remember that for now we're only noting these inequalities between men and women, not saying anything about whether they count as injustices. So as long as the empirical claims are true, then we should accept the cases for further consideration as proof of the second sexism. And this one does seem quite obviously true. Before I move on to family and other relationships, I want to make one side note about arguments that appeal to equality. Equality can be achieved either by leveling up, giving the worse off party what the better off party has, or by leveling down, taking away from the better off party what they had so that both parties have the same. In this interview for the Free Press, science writer Nicholas Wade says,
I think no one knows the answer to this very severe problem we have of declining fertility rates. Mm-hmm. Well, if a society is in peril, men are expected to give up their lives in defense of it. So if a society is imperiled for this unusual reason of infertility, should we expect women to shoulder the responsibility and step up and have more children even though they don't want them?
This can be read as a leveling down argument. It's fine that there's conscription and combat for men and all its attendant sacrifice and horror. We just need to add some comparable sacrifice and horror for women. And here's a way to do it: unwanted pregnancy and child-rearing for the sake of the nation. Okay, what about family and other relationships? There are several different things going on under this heading. That includes men being less likely to get custody of their children after separation or divorce, men being less certain as to their paternity, men getting less parental leave than women, and gay men being more victimized than women. Let's focus on custody and parental leave, which have the most in common. Women tend to do more of the care work. That is often discussed in terms of its disadvantages to women, for example, in terms of career prospects and financial security later in life. Carol Quinn and Rosemary Tong, in one of the responses to Benatar in the special issue of Social Theory and Practice, say, Benatar does not make enough of the point that as a result of the second sexism, men have been taught that they are not good caregivers. If any lesson is dehumanizing, it is the message that one is bad at nurturing and good for fighting. This is a good point, I think. If it can be shown that the explanation for differences in award of custody and differences between maternity and paternity leave have no satisfactory explanation, then this will be another inequality that we should take forward to consider whether it is also an injustice. Let me now say something about the inclusion of violence in this list of inequalities that disfavor males. This one is a bit less straightforward and raises a number of issues that will be relevant in the next part of the lecture. What he's said already about combat is one example of men experiencing disproportionate violence compared to women. But Benatar wants to make the point about men experiencing violence more general. He says, with two exceptions, men are much more likely than women to be the targets of aggression and violence. The two exceptions are sexual assault and domestic violence. Apart from those two exceptions, according to data from the United States, more than 3 times more men than women are murdered, and nearly twice as many men as women are subject to aggravated assault. Data from the UK shows much the same thing, with men aged 16 to 24 being at the highest risk. Men suffer more violence during war and conflict, even when they are not combatants. About the Kosovo conflict, for example, Benatar writes, while women and girls constituted the majority of rape victims, men and boys were tortured and killed in much greater numbers. More generally, he says, there has been a long history of human violence in which males have been the primary victims of mass murder and other serious human rights violations. Now, you might be thinking, as I was when I first read this, doesn't it matter that this violence done to men is also done by men? In the terms for thinking about whether women are oppressed set up in Lecture 1, our interest was in what one group does to another. Feminists don't just talk about women experiencing violence, they talk about male violence against women and girls, where sexual assault and domestic violence are crimes perpetrated by men against women. Feminists refer to these facts to partly substantiate the broader claim that women are oppressed by men, or women are subordinated to men, not just that women are oppressed and leaving open who or what might be doing that, or that no one might be. Benatar, however, does not talk at all in this chapter about who the perpetrators of this violence that men experience are, or why they experience it. For him, it is enough to observe that there is an inequality between men as a group and women as a group, where men experience more violence than women, the two exceptions aside. He's concerned with the fact of this inequality alone, not that there is some oppressor group responsible for it. Benatar also does not talk at all in this chapter about why the violence is done. When we talk about an issue like disproportionate care work performed by women, we're usually interested in the broader explanation of this phenomenon. Why is it the case that women tend to do more care work and men less? People argue over whether women care more because they're biologically disposed that way, and over whether the conditions for equal opportunity are satisfactory enough now that there is no more to do than simply respect her choice as to care rather than work, or to care as much as or more than work. It would be hugely relevant to discover that there was an ideology pushing women away from work and towards care. We'd want to know what it is people believe about women, such that any woman internalizing those beliefs might go on to choose care. Perhaps the why question in the case of male violence against other males can sometimes be answered with because he was a man. But often, other answers will be more plausible. Instead of saying that the violence of war is an instance of male inequality, even though it is males that cause it, we could say that it's an instance of nationality or ethnicity inequality. In the Kosovo conflict, men weren't killed because they were men, or for being men, or because of pernicious false beliefs about men, or even because of benevolent but false beliefs about men. They weren't killed because they were men at all, but because they were on one side or another of an ethnic conflict. Serbian men killed Albanian men because they were Albanian, and Albanian men killed Serbian men because they were Serbian. Benatar might want to insist that it is because they were men, because the fact that they were not women is relevant to the explanation of why they are in the war in the first place. But note that this is quite different to the explanation of why men sexually assault women. There is an ideology that says that women are for men to There is not an ideology that says that men per se are to be killed in war. Rather, there are rules of war that say that enemy combatants can be killed, and those enemy combatants happen to be men. Remember that if we want to resist Benatar's argument, we can do so either at this descriptive step, denying that there is in fact an inequality, or at the normative step, accepting that there is an inequality but denying that it is an injustice. If we want to resist it at this descriptive step, then we will need to insist that it matters who inflicts the violence and or why it is inflicted. One way to make some progress on thinking about whether such an insistence would be reasonable is to consider two versions of a case where it's women who inflict some negative treatment on each other. First, consider beauty practices, and suppose that it is wholly women who impose appearance-based expectations on each other, and men have nothing to do with it and no preference either way. Second, suppose that women enjoy destroying each other's reputations, but never do this to men, and men never do this to women. In the first case, we might want to say that while women do this to each other, they nonetheless do it because of men in some explanatory sense. For example, because of a history of patriarchy that established cultural norms about how women are supposed to look that women themselves then began enforcing. That's a way of making the first case like the case of male violence against women and girls, just a little less direct. The answer to the who question would be women, but the answer to the why question would be men. In the second case, we might want to say that whatever is going on there, it really is an intra-group matter. Still, it might be tempting to reach for explanations of why members of oppressed groups mistreat each other, suggesting perhaps that this is because they have internalized their oppressor's hatred. If we accept that such an explanation is available, then just as for the beauty practices case, the answer to the who question would be women, but the answer to the why question would be men. If we deny that any such explanation is available, then we have a case on a par with Benatar's example of men experiencing more violence, and a question of whether we'd be happy to accept both as inequalities between the sexes. Here's a reason not to insist that whatever makes it to the inequalities list has to be inflicted by another group or because of another group in some explanatory sense. The sex groups are exhausted by male and female, and men have historically been the ones with social power. Having a requirement that the differences need to be perpetrated by another group will amount to the requirement that something is an inequality against men only if women are the ones who cause it, and that may mean that almost nothing makes it onto the list. If we want to be charitable to the idea of a second sexism, we shouldn't insist upon a requirement that makes it virtually impossible. Although, of course, a feminist might wonder why she should be expected to be charitable to this idea. Let's keep these questions in mind as we go on to look in more detail at Benatar's case for thinking of at least some of these inequalities as injustices. Part 3. From inequality to injustice. So far I've been using the language of inequality and injustice to keep things uniform between the first and second parts of the lecture, but I'll now switch to Benatar's preferred language, which is disadvantage and wrongful discrimination. Disadvantage is the parallel of inequality, a descriptive claim, and wrongful discrimination is the parallel of injustice, a normative claim. Let me start by noting what Benatar says about sexism in the introduction to his book, to emphasize the importance of this move from the descriptive to the normative. Because there are sex differences, it is sometimes appropriate to discriminate. Thus, once one has established that a disadvantage is the product of discrimination on the basis of somebody's sex, one then needs to establish whether or not that discrimination is fair, just, or justifiable. We do that by asking whether sex makes differential treatment appropriate. His example is insurance companies providing cover for breast cancer screening to women but not men, which is appropriate given that women are more likely to get breast cancer. In Benatar's view, discrimination is wrong when people are treated differently without there being a relevant difference between the people that justifies the differential treatment. differential treatment is justified by good objective reason, not just some reason or other being offered. But he says he wants people with different views of what discrimination consists in to be able to get on board with his arguments. So he does not insist on this particular view in the book. In many cases, he thinks that something is wrongful discrimination will just be obvious, like not letting women into university, and he thinks like allowing the corporal punishment in schools of boys only. He's going to call wrongful discrimination against boys and men sex discrimination, sexist discrimination, and sexism. Hence, the second sexism of the book's title. But he doesn't want a verbal dispute over what sexism means. He says, the really important conclusion for which I need to argue is that males are the victim of wrongful discrimination or even merely wrongful treatment on the basis of their sex. I happen to think that such discrimination merits the name sexism, but even if I were incorrect about that, my critics could not justify on that basis any complacency about the wrongful discrimination of which males are the victims. The question we're asking now is which of the list of what in part 2 we called inequalities and are now calling disadvantages are also wrongful discrimination. We'll focus on the 3 that we talked about in part 2, conscription and combat, family, specifically care for children relating to differential award of custody and differential workplace parental leave offerings, and violence. Okay, conscription and combat. The argument here is a comparative one, resting on the fact that women are exempt from conscription in most of the places where conscription exists. Benatar says many more men who would like to avoid such positions are discriminated against by being forced into them. Benatar considers the idea that this is appropriate or justified discrimination. That depends on thinking that biological differences between males and females make females unsuited to combat. He notes that if the differences that made males suited to combat and females not were only social, then we should still say it's unfair discrimination to socialize men in a way that then made them more suitable for combat and so more liable to all of the many harms of conscription. He paraphrases the view he's considering as follows. 1, there are physical and psychological differences between men and women. 2, these differences are not primarily a product of socialization, but rather substantially the product of biology. 3, the attributes females have and the attributes they lack make them less likely to be good soldiers. 4, the guiding consideration in determining who performs which tasks in the military should be military effectiveness. 5, military effectiveness requires sending into combat those troops who are most likely to do the job well. 6, therefore, females should not be sent into combat. Benatar criticizes this view in a number of ways. One is to say that even if men and women are different in the way proposed here, those differences might contribute to military effectiveness rather than undermine it, for example, by supporting less risk-taking. This is a reference to the familiar claim that there are sex differences in willingness to take risks. Another is to say that there have been plenty of examples in the past where everyone was very confident they were doing justified discrimination on the basis of such difference as invoked here. For example, when women were kept out of universities. Couldn't this exemption of women from conscription be just another case like this? Benatar writes, this is not to imply that current conservative arguments about women in combat are contemporary analogues of those earlier views. Instead, the aim is to show that they might be. If people in former times could have held their preposterous views with the conviction they did, it is entirely possible that people today could be making the same mistake. Note that the reasoning in the conscription case runs the other way around to these examples. Women were not exempt from universities. It's not being considered as discrimination against women that they're not included in what Benatar in the next sentence calls the horrors of war. Rather, he's considering that men are discriminated against by being included, and the proof of their discrimination is in the fact that women are exempt and men are not. This differential exemption is the grounds for the wrongful discrimination claim. because decisions about who is exempt and who is not are made on the basis of sex. Benatar's conclusion is that even if there are some biologically based differences between the sexes, conscripting and sending into combat only men is unfair discrimination. He's more ambivalent about the child custody example. He writes, "When males seek custody of their children, they are less likely than females to obtain custody. It is hard to prove that this is the product of discrimination without looking at individual custody decisions and comparing them. It is possible, after all, that fewer males are suited to caring for children than their ex-wives, and that the courts are appropriately awarding custody on the basis of the children's best interests. Still, he says, this is unlikely to explain away the full difference between men and women, and the existence of strong breadwinner, homemaker stereotypes must surely play into court decisions." He's also more ambivalent about parental leave discrimination. A mother who wants to breastfeed and doesn't have sufficient flexibility in work to be able to express enough milk for the baby while away will need maternity leave to a greater extent than a father does. One interesting response on behalf of feminists that Benatar considers is that differential parental leave offerings actually discriminate against women, even when they offer more time to mothers than fathers, because the structure of leave means mothers have to take on a greater burden of childcare. Benatar says, "I think that there is merit to this argument, but he still wants to leave some space for the fathers who either want to or need to care for their infants or to share equally in such care. They are denied the same benefits guaranteed to mothers. Even if such fathers are in a minority, it is nonetheless unfair to them." What about violence? In this chapter, Benatar addresses the point I raised in part 2 about the perpetrators of violence against men being men. He writes, "When men or women are the victims of violence, it does not really matter whether the perpetrator is of the same sex or a different sex. What matters is that they have been attacked." He goes on, "The suggestion that it is other men who have attacked them can be seen to minimize the wrong only if we inappropriately blur the distinction between the identities of the particular men, failing to distinguish between the perpetrator and the victim, and instead identifying both simply as men." In order to make the point clearer, he offers the example of black-on-black violence. This is really no better than the person who minimizes the violence suffered by blacks in American inner cities or South African townships, for example, by saying that it is perpetrated by other blacks. But I would say this is not about minimizing violence, it's about whether that violence could be aptly called racism. And my intuition, at least, is that it would be extremely strange to describe within-group racial violence as racism, just as it's strange to me to describe male-on-male violence as sexism. And remembering that Benatar asked us not to get hung up on the word sexism, let me restate that. It would be strange to describe within-group racial violence as wrongful discrimination on the basis of race, just as it is strange to describe male-on-male violence as wrongful discrimination on the basis of sex. Whatever reasons men have for assaulting one another, it isn't usually that they are men or that they are failing to live up to standards for men, etc. Benatar ends the discussion of violence in chapter 4 by saying, "There are very many cases where males are selected for or not protected from violence because they are male. And these cases are sufficient to demonstrate that males suffer sex discrimination in this area." This suggests he may be willing to walk back most of what was countenanced as violence in chapter 2 and rest his case on conscription alone, which is a clear case of males being not protected from violence because they are not female. In Benatar's view, conscription is wrongful discrimination and therefore sexism. Inequality in child custody awards and parental leave might be wrongful discrimination and therefore sexism for at least a small proportion of the overall difference between the sexes. And violence in those cases where males are selected for it, for example, corporal punishment in schools, or not protected from it, for example, exemptions from conscription for women, because they are male, are cases of wrongful discrimination and therefore sexism. If victory for the second sexism, meaning that there is a second sexism, is established by at least one case of wrongful discrimination against men, then this looks like a victory for the second sexism thesis. If victory is established in some other way, for example, a sufficient number of cases, then it would depend on where that threshold for sufficiency is set. To finish, let me say something brief about whether inequality or wrongful discrimination against men is really an opponent of feminism, as my positioning of this topic in the course suggests. Both von Parijs and Benatar deny that it is, and say it's just something that also matters. Benatar does think, however, that it would be inconsistent for those he calls egalitarian feminists to refuse to care at all about wrongful discrimination against men. These are feminists who care about women's inequality because they care about equality. His reasoning, which seems fair enough, is that anyone who claims to care about equality should care about inequality of any group that experiences it. Those who don't fit this description of egalitarian feminist, however, don't seem to have any particular reason to be interested in inequality that disfavors men or in wrongful discrimination against men. To those feminists, we might offer a more instrumental reason to be interested in this topic, which is that there is considerable popular sympathy with the idea that men are the ones who are disadvantaged, and so it's worth knowing how to respond to that idea in order to advocate for feminism. Here's the political philosopher Peter Higgins reflecting on his time teaching a course called Feminist Theory at Eastern Michigan University, cross-listed between philosophy and women's and gender studies. Higgins writes, "Because it may be used to fulfill requirements in our general education program, feminist theory attracts a large number of students, many of whom begin with no particular interest in or background knowledge about feminism. In response to what Marilyn Frye calls a fundamental claim of feminism, namely that women are oppressed, many of my students express reservations. A common source of student resistance to feminism and to the specific claim that women are oppressed is that men are oppressed as men. Students who are inclined toward this belief, a large minority in any given class, argue that the masculine gender role imposes a variety of oppressive burdens on men and cite myriad examples in evidence of their own view. Men must pay on dates, men are expected to be the breadwinners for their families, men have more limited fashion options than women and may not wear makeup. Men rarely receive primary custody of children following divorce. Men are discriminated against when they seek certain types of employment, such as in daycare centers. Men are more likely than women overall to be victims of violence. Men can be drafted for war." For those who are interested, that paper also has a nice discussion of the ways in which second sexism type views can be a threat to feminism. For anyone who wants to read more on this topic, I've listed all the papers from the Law, Ethics and Philosophy special issue on von Parijs' paper and the Social Theory and Practice special issue on Benatar's paper in the video description, as well as links to 2 related debates between feminists, me and Kate, against anti-feminists over at the Maiden Mother Matriarch podcast. And I'll see you next week for our final lecture, where we'll talk about obstacles to the feminist future.